Nathan.
Natasha.
We are indeed very happy to have you here.
They let me out just in time.
They did. They did. You are our Asia correspondent, but you're based in Beijing. So I think we should start with China. We're coming off an eventful few weeks in Chinese politics, and much of the commentary that I've certainly read is how the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party has cemented Xi Jinping's authority as the new autocratic leader of China, with his thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and with no successor in the wings. I was wondering what this looks like to you from your perch in Beijing. Are you seeing a similar analysis?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. It's nice to be able to see the faces that are reading some of the words we put together. As a correspondent, your relationship with your readers is typically fingers and a screen, so it's nice to have real life people. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Xi Jinping he's been an interesting leader. There has been, it appears, a determination by the elders of the Communist Party that China had gone adrift, and that China, at the very highest levels of its elite politics, had developed a number of factions, and that each of those factions had developed its own territories, and that from the very highest levels on down, there was not a unified presence, and that had created fertile ground for the tremendous amounts of corruption that have emerged in China, that had made it difficult for the central government to pursue the policies that it thought were needed. China's always been, because it's such an enormous place, it's always been a place where regions and lower levels of government have actually been able to do a fair amount of things independently. I mean, many of the Chinese provinces are larger than most countries around the world, and governors and party secretaries of those provinces carry a tremendous amount of power just because of the number of people that they govern. But it appears that there was a decision that they needed a stronger leader, and they needed somebody who would come in. And Xi Jinping has certainly taken that on, and he's taken on power in a number of ways. He has made very skillful use of an anti-corruption campaign to help cement his power. In the past 5 years, his right-hand man was the man who led the Chinese graft-busting commission, and they were very successful at imposing his leadership, and he has created new pillars of leadership that are actually outside of the Communist Party. There are a number of what they call small leading groups that are just committees that have a tremendous amount of authority that he leads in a number of different ways. And so through this, there have been many comparisons between Xi Jinping and Mao, just because when we think about Chinese leaders who have been singular figures in the Chinese political system, not faceless bureaucrats, but people with name power, people with a sort of charisma. Of course, Mao is the figure that tends to come to mind. And that comparison works in certain ways in terms of the centralization of power in one figure, as opposed to the Politburo Standing Committee and the 7 or 9 top figures in the Chinese political system ruling through sort of a consensus system. And a system, by the way, which was put in place to ensure that there was not another Mao-like figure. But Xi Jinping has subverted that and has taken on a great amount of power on himself. The comparison breaks down in a couple of ways. Mao governed in many ways through creating chaos. And Mao governed in some ways by pitting people against each other. And this is why you had some of the horrors of the Cultural Revolution and that sort of thing. And Xi Jinping is a very different leader in that respect. Xi Jinping is a leader who prioritizes control. He prioritizes the control of the Communist Party. And he also is a leader in a state that is a much more effective state. China, from a bureaucratic perspective, from a governance perspective, is a much more effective country than it was when Mao took over in the remnants of World War II and tried to build up China into the roots of what it has become today. But Xi Jinping has a tremendous amount of personal power, and in the comparison also succeeds in another way, in that For Xi Jinping, what is good for China is good for the party, and what is good for the party is good for China. And so you have seen, in some ways, a renationalization in China of different aspects of life, of civic life, of political life, of economic life, and a strengthening of the Communist Party from the central levels as a governing institution. The argument from supporters of this is that we need a strong party, we need a unified country in order to move past their current economic status on a per capita GDP basis. China, for all its overall financial power, for all its enormously wealthy companies and the amount of the billions of dollars that they can dispatch around the world, China, on an individual average wealth basis, is still a relatively poor place. And so they want to move past that, and they want to gain in sort of wealth and strength. And the feeling is that to do that, they need a unified country, and they need a country that is sort of marching in lockstep behind a leader. And from that stem many of the things we're seeing in China today.
Okay. What about Xi's international goals and China's position on the world stage? You're talking about consolidating things within the country, but then there's this idea of exporting their development model elsewhere. Some people think China is planning on replacing the US as the dominant power in Asia and sort of reshaping the international order so it's more in line with their interests. Do you see that happening as well?
And though some people include a lot of Canadians, by the way.
Yeah.
There was a recent poll by the Asia Pacific Foundation that asked, in the next decade, who do you expect to be the most responsible global leader? And 36% chose the US, but 28% chose China. Quite a large number of Canadians in that poll who, and Canadians in this poll, when they compared China and the US, saw China as a national leader that is more interested in enhancing and creating peace and stability around the world than the US, and some of these other measures. So Canadian perspectives on China are changing quite quickly. I've been saying for a while that I felt that China is becoming evangelical about its model. And you're seeing this in a number of different ways. And there has been a reticence to say this out loud. So Xi Jinping earlier this year got on the stage in Davos with great numbers of some of the more powerful people on earth assembled before him, and delivered a fairly stirring speech in defense of globalization. And this, of course, was shortly after the Donald Trump election. This was all very obvious what was happening. But at the time, there was a reticence in the Chinese discourse to effectively call this what it was, which was China taking a fairly large stride, a fairly large step up to say that, we think that we have something to offer. But that meekness is very fast disappearing. And in the last couple of days, state media have been talking about China as a role model for the world, very directly using that word. And you're seeing this in a number of different ways. You may have heard this term, the One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road, or Belt and Road. And they had a Belt and Road Forum, which was BARF as an acronym. So they quickly they quickly had to change the name of that. But it's more than mere talk. It's this fairly concerted effort in which the party has set a priority, and all kinds of different elements of Chinese society are sort of coming behind it in an attempt to spread the Chinese development model to many of its neighbors in through Southeast and Central Asia. And the Chinese development model doesn't work particularly well without the Chinese political model. And so what we're seeing now, and we've seen this from leaders in Turkey and in Hungary and elsewhere, an embrace of the Chinese model. This notion that China, because from one perspective, you can look at some of the issues that we have in Western society today. What we're seeing, problems on social media. You could say China has a solution for that. They just censor it. So there is
a model.
They do. They have a model, and there are groups of countries, probably not Western countries, but of course Western countries are far from the entire world. There are groups of countries and growing groups of countries that find that attractive, that find this notion of stability that China has managed to achieve attractive. And in fact, I remember I was in northern Myanmar a couple of years ago, and I was speaking with refugees from violence there, and many of them were refugees from violence near the borderlands with China. And and these were people that had actually, it's quite a porous border, so they've gone across into China to work. And the reason that they've gone into China to work is because they can earn 5 times more money working in China than they could in Myanmar. So we have, for a long time, been accustomed to this idea of America as the city on the hill. But there are places in the world, and growing places in the world, where China is becoming a city on a hill in some ways. It's becoming a land of promise. And I think if China succeeds in pushing forward, if China succeeds in pushing through some of the economic issues that are building in the country and that sort of thing, there's reason to believe that will continue, that the attractiveness of what China's been able to do, which we should keep in mind is dramatically different from our political structures, our economic structures. It's a very state-run system. It's a very authoritarian system. It looks like a modern country, and in many ways it is, but from a political perspective, it's dramatically different from what we have here. But I think one of the things that there's a good chance is going to happen is that's going to prove more attractive as we move forward.
Do you think it's proving more attractive to Canadians as well? So when we talk about engagement in terms of trade, economically speaking, what do you think is our best approach? Because we have things like we're joining the Asia Infrastructure Bank. We have state-run entrants that are coming to the Canadian economy, like the ACON deal, for example, which is undergoing a security review as part of the government's net benefit test. We want free trade, especially given our trading prospects with our neighbor to the south. They're rather perilous at the moment. What do you think is the right kind of engagement for Canada?
I mean, that's such a difficult question. I think what we're seeing, though, is that in Canada, like in a lot of other places, some of the dislocations, particularly in the U.S., and some of the instability there, and what that has meant in terms of, I think, what we think about the success of the democratic system in some ways, that the ability of the democratic system to be a system that allows us to choose leaders who are the best leaders for us. And I think that's reflected in changing attitudes among Canadians. There's been for a long time deep skepticism among Canadians about, for example, entering a free trade agreement with China. And that's changing very quickly. We now have something like 69–70% of Canadians who support the idea of a free trade agreement with China. Justin Trudeau is going to be in China in early December. It'll be his second visit there as Prime Minister. And from what I understand, they've yet to make a cabinet decision on this yet, but there has been an expectation that this trip would be a good time to formalize the start of negotiations on a free trade agreement. Now, this will take a long time to happen. This is not something that's going to happen overnight, and there's still a fairly large divide between the Canadian expectations for a free trade agreement, which are for a modern free trade agreement that includes provisions on labor standards and environmental standards and this sort of thing, and the Chinese expectations for a free trade agreement, which are that it'd be a fairly simple, rudimentary free trade agreement with the possibility of expanding it down the road if that happens. But I think we are so, in terms of how Canada engages with China, I think it's a difficult question, because I think there are obviously economic imperatives to dealing with China. China is the world's second largest economy. If it continues on the trajectory it's on, it's going to be the world's largest economy. It's also an economy that runs very differently from our own, and it's an economy that is changing in ways that are making it more different from our own. China has had a lengthy period of opening up. China has had, and still has, a very vibrant private sector industries, and we've seen these. If you go to China now, there are remarkable things you can do in China in terms of mobile payments, in terms of their online retail space. My wife and I sometimes ask each other when we're in Canada over the summer, we come here typically for vacation, what do you miss about China? And we say Taobao, which is basically their Amazon, where you can find anything, and then it shows up at your door, often very fast. Via drone? Not yet, but that's coming. They're working on that. So there's a lot of, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of things happening in the private space. We're seeing, for example, the Communist Party setting up committees inside of corporations, inside of foreign corporations inside of China, inside of private corporations inside of China. And the argument is that these committees will enable smoother and better communication between companies and the government, that they effectively take the role of government relations offices. But of course,
within the company?
Within the company. But then you also end up with a physical imprint of the Communist Party, even on private sector companies. And this is something that's changing actually right now, and something that's increasing right now. And I think we also need to be aware that when we're dealing with China, we are dealing with a country that's very different. When we're dealing with a country that in many respects, its barriers to entry, its sense of protectionism is rising as opposed to decreasing. And there is, I think there are real questions to be asked about if China is the custodian of globalization, what sort of globalization is it? Because in many ways it's different from what we've had in the past.
When we think of state-owned enterprises, what does that really mean when we think of these companies investing, let's say, in a Canadian company?
Yeah, I mean, there's been questions about how do state-owned companies act, and are they profit-seeking? And I think for the most part, many state-owned companies are profit-seeking. But the state-owned sector is a huge sector in China,
right,
and it accomplishes a lot of good for the Chinese government. It allows the Chinese government to direct its economic and its corporate space in ways that match with Chinese government priorities. So that's one of the things you see on Belt and Road. You see a tremendous number of companies that are moving in the direction that the Chinese government has set for them. It also allows, I mean, the state-owned companies are also a huge engine of social welfare in China. You have large state-owned companies inside of China that provide tremendous numbers of social benefits, tremendous numbers of jobs. One of the reasons you end up with these things called zombie companies that are just sort of companies without work but with workers is because they become tools of social welfare to keep people. So yeah, it's a significant sector, and it was. I was speaking with a professor in town yesterday, and he was telling me he's done quite an in-depth study of state-owned companies, and in many places you'll have sectors with mixed representation, some state-owned and some private, and because the state-owned companies operate on effectively a subsidized basis, they distort entire markets, and you see a lot of that in China. And so it's one of the ways in which the Chinese economy can be quite dissimilar from our own.
So you said our Prime Minister is visiting China in December. What's the perception of Canada and the Trudeau government? Are we seen as pushovers? Are we seen as partners? Are we tough negotiators?
We have good beef. We have good lobster. We have good blueberries. These are some of the things I've learned since I've been there. The Chinese government had a fractious relationship with the Harper government, and the Harper government on China, anyway. So it had sort of two eras, sort of a hostile era and a much more friendly era that followed it.
Engagement.
Yeah, and so the Trudeau government seems to, from the outset, have been committed to this idea of Canada developing a greater trading relationship with China. And that was before some of the ruptures around NAFTA. And I think what's happened with NAFTA has only underscored the need for Canada to diversify its economy, because of course we are, as a nation, an economy that's heavily tied to the United States. And so that is a priority. So, I mean, I feel like Justin Trudeau sees China a little like his father saw China. And Pierre Trudeau and his sons went to China in 1990. In fact, they wanted to go to China on a trip 6 weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. But the Chinese actually called it off. They said, this might not be a great time. But they went the next year instead. And it was intended to be a private citizen's visit. But of course it wasn't. There were official dinners and banquets everywhere they went. And I think that Pierre Trudeau's idea, and of course he got a lot of criticism for his courting of bad actors, or courting or his acceptance of it. And it seemed like he felt like he was more willing to listen than to criticize. And I feel like in some ways the Trudeau attitude is more like that. And so I think China has appreciated that, and the Trudeau government has signaled a new priority for China. They've installed the first political appointee as an ambassador to Beijing now, in John McCallum, and they've been thrilled about this. So what it gets them, I don't know, but they've been happy about it.
So how do you think the question of human rights then plays into that equation?
For Canada?
For Canada, I think, yeah. I think we sit there and polls have shown that human rights and democratic reform still rank quite high with Canadians. And, you know, whether you're talking about political dissent in China, like the horrible treatment.
There's none left,
of
so
the,
that's easy. I'm being sarcastic.
Human rights in Hong Kong,
Right.
detention of the Hong Kong booksellers, and, you know, the persecution of the Uyghurs and ethnic minorities. I mean,
yeah, it's an issue, and this is, I don't think this is one of these things that anybody has an easy answer to. I think the Canadian government has tried to say that they want to do both. That it's not an either-or situation; it's both, and I suppose that's a perfectly reasonable answer. I think what we are seeing in this notion, if the notion is that China needs to move forward as a unified nation, and that moving forward as a unified nation is good for China as a whole, then it's not a difficult argument to make that people who dissent from that, people who detract from that, need to be silenced in some way because they're detracting from something that is for the better good. So the Chinese conception of human rights is very different from ours. Our conception of human rights is a very individualized conception of human rights. Right. Yeah. And the Chinese conception of human rights, has a much larger economic component than ours. There you will often hear China say, we have massively improved the human rights of our people because so many of them are no longer living in poverty.
Yeah.
Right. And the ranks of people in China who have not just a Chinese middle class lifestyle, but effectively a North American middle class lifestyle are now sizable. Many people. I don't have a car in China, but a lot of my neighbors do, and I wish I had one. This is one of the issues, but what we're seeing is a fracturing in the international community in terms of its the willingness to talk about some of these human rights issues with China. The European Union, for example, has had difficulty making unified statements. So you are now having individual countries coming together as opposed to the European Union making a unified statement about some of the things that are happening in China with the jailing of lawyers, with what they've done with people in Hong Kong and that sort of thing. And because China has a tremendous amount of economic power, and you've seen in many cases where they've been willing to use that economic power to further political ends. And that's another one of the issues that I think we need to keep in mind as we pursue a relationship with China. It's one of the potential risks.
Your recent reporting from Xinjiang has been quite unsettling. I hope you've read it. Nathan's written about how Chinese authorities have exerted pressure on the Uyghurs, restricting travel, inspecting cell phones. There's an amazing re-education campaign that's going on. That's, you know, many Uyghurs have been taken away by the authorities. Can you tell us more about your personal experiences in covering the story? We know you were detained. We know your laptop was seized, caused a great deal of consternation back here on King Street.
Which I did not expect, by the way. the power of a tweet, which was a past tense tweet. I feel like I should emphasize this. Yeah. So Xinjiang is this area in Western China. It's about a sixth of the Chinese landmass, and it has historically been and remains a place where the population of Uyghurs lives, and Uyghurs are a sort of a Turkic culture, a largely Muslim in China ethnic minority who live there. And Uyghurs have been involved in acts of terror. There were Uyghurs in Guantanamo. There were Uyghurs who have joined ISIS. There were Uyghurs who committed acts of terror on Chinese territory, including in Beijing. There was a train station was in Kunming, and there was in Beijing. It was a car that crashed right at the Forbidden City, actually, right in the very heart of power in China, and it's a pretty good way to get the authorities to notice you in China.
Yep.
And so the response has been quite thorough and quite overarching in terms of what China describes as an effort to root out extremism. What the human rights groups will say is a harsh response directed at an ethnicity as opposed to extremists. So I've been there a couple of times. I've been to Xinjiang 3 times. There's only one part of China that journalists can't freely travel to, and that's Tibet. The only way to go to Tibet as a journalist is to get a government trip, to go there on a formal trip. Xinjiang you can go to, but it is, like many areas in China, a sensitive area. The border with North Korea is a very sensitive area. So there are places that you go to as a journalist that you know in China that there's a good chance that you'll get picked up by authorities. And picked up by authorities can mean a number of things. It typically means being asked questions. It typically means they want to see your documents. I have a government-issued foreign journalist press card. They always want to see that to ensure that I'm really a foreign journalist and not a spy. And they will often want to look through your pictures. They will ask you to delete your pictures in some areas. And they'll detain you, and they'll hassle you, and they'll hassle the people that you're with. So often when I travel in China, I'll have a driver, and I'll have somebody, a news assistant, a colleague of mine who will travel with me. And if you're interviewing somebody, those people can be interrogated. And so in Xinjiang, you know, as it's a sensitive area for China, that these are possibilities. So when I go there, I don't make any plans in advance. I buy tickets at the last second. When you check into a hotel in China, the first thing they do is they scan your passport and they scan your visa. And if they see a journalist visa, it immediately gets reported to the local police. And sometimes you get a knock on the door at midnight. Sometimes you get lucky. And so, when one tries to take efforts to sort of switch hotels every day.
Really?
Yeah. I travel with everything in a single backpack, so I have everything with me all the time. And I also try to go to less sensitive areas first, so you can get a bit of reporting done before you go to the most sensitive areas. So in this most recent trip, I knew that the area that I ended up getting detained in was going to be a very sensitive area, and I got there and I was on the ground for about 10 minutes when police started showing up, and it was a couple, and then it was more, and then it was a lot more. And eventually I got taken to, I was in this small, sort of very dusty village, not far from the borders with like Afghanistan, Pakistan. I mean, in that area. I mean, you're in a very different part of China. Was taken to a local party office, a local government office, and they're very clever in how they do this. They always just say, well, these people want to meet you. These people want to meet you. And then at one point I was like, well, I don't really want to meet them. I want to go.
That's right.
Right.
I've got better things to do.
And then I got in my car and turned it on, and all of a sudden 3 people hopped in the back seat. So at that point, if I was going somewhere, I was going somewhere with company. Anyways, eventually I ended up going to the government office with a police car with flashing lights in front of me and another police car with flashing lights behind me. And we went in there, and sort of growing numbers of people showed up, and they were all very angry because at this point in time it was 11:30 and they'd all been called out of bed and hauled out to deal with this white guy who showed up. So at first they wanted to search through my bags, and then they wanted to search through my photos, and they had picked me up within 10 minutes of arriving there. So I actually had not done it. Their intention was to ensure that I could not do any reporting there. And that if I had done any reporting there, that they could expunge it so that it no longer existed. So they wanted to know who I had interviewed, what I had done, what photos I might have had, what interviews I might have done. And I told them none, and they looked through my camera and confirmed actually that there was none. And then they were... And I actually, at one point, called the foreign ministry. There's a strange thing in China where the foreign ministry, which is the one that's responsible for foreign journalists, because there are many different parts of the Chinese government, and they don't always act together. And the foreign ministry can sometimes be an advocate. So I called up the foreign ministry at midnight and got them to talk with the people who had me there. And he tried to intervene, but the foreign ministry doesn't have a lot of power, so it doesn't always do much good to call them. And so eventually, it felt like things were over, and they said, well, let's go have dinner. I was like, I don't want dinner. At this point, it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I just want to get out of here. And they're like, no, we're going to go have dinner. So we went, and we found a restaurant that somehow had the owner still in there. No, of course not. It wasn't open. He was forced to reopen and make us food. So we sat there and talked, and then we came back, and they said, we want to look through your bag again. And I said, okay, because we'd already been through this. And they're like, take out your laptop. And I'd done that before, and they hadn't done anything with it. and they said, you know, put it down, and then they just grabbed it and like ran with it. They physically took it away. And I was like, oh, I don't have my laptop now anymore. This is a problem. And they had already introduced themselves as the Ministry of State Security, the secret police. And so at this point, I was like, I'm not leaving. And they said, well, we're not staying. We're taking your laptop away. We're taking it a 2-hour drive away to Kashgar, which is the local major center where they have a bigger office. So I didn't really have a choice at that point. So at that point, I got in a car, and they followed me for 2 hours through the middle of the night until about a couple kilometers short of my hotel, and then they waved because they were breaking off, with a great big smile on their face, bye! At this point, I was steaming because I had my laptop.
Must have felt surreal.
Yeah, and then on the way, I tweeted about it. I said, I've been detained for 3 hours, and then things just sort of spiraled from there. But yeah, I got my laptop back after 12 hours. They gave it back. I was on the first flight I could find to get out, and I was actually at the airport in the waiting lounge, and my phone rang, and they said, hey, we have your laptop. I was like, oh, do you? Actually, no, what they said was, we found your laptop. as if I had like dropped it on the side of the street or something like that. I was like, oh, how nice that you found my laptop. Anyways, so I got my laptop back and never once used it again because I didn't know what they might have put on it, but physically, I took repossession of my laptop. Did
you know what was happening behind the scenes here?
I had a sense for it. I got a phone call from the foreign minister. Chrystia Freeland called me, and she said, I want you to know that I'm interested in what's going on. So, I guess maybe it helps having a former journalist as a foreign minister. I was completely blown away by the degree of interest in this. And so were a lot of other journalists in Beijing. I remember talking with an American journalist who said, yeah, the American embassy told me if I get detained or if I get put in prison, don't worry, they'll get consular access sometime within 90 days. I was like, oh, okay.
Well, it sounds unnerving, but your coverage of the Rohingya ethnic cleansing from Bangladesh was even more unnerving. The reporting that revealed that soldiers were continuing to fire Rohingya homes and attack those who were attempting to flee. We were checking this morning, how many have been...
607,000 since late August.
Displaced, yeah. Right? That must have been a difficult assignment emotionally, I think.
So shortly after I got to China, there was this massive typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines that took out the city of Tacloban. And it was, for me, a profound experience because I had never before experienced a place where normal social and civic function just ended. You could walk around with a $100 bill and you couldn't buy anything. It meant nothing. Money meant nothing. It was crazy because there was nothing left. And there were bodies floating in water that people were drawing from to drink. And it was a horrible situation, but I think for me, I found what has been happening with the Rohingya much more difficult. It's because I think it's one thing to deal with human misery from a natural disaster, but it's a very different thing to deal with human misery that's been caused by other humans. And talking to people, and it was just, in sort of the hard-hearted way of journalists, it's an easy story to do because you can walk and talk to anybody, and everybody of the Rohingya that are there have unbelievable stories in the worst possible way. And so it's not like you have to talk to a lot of people to find something. And it was, just hearing about, women talking about fleeing and seeing other women lying bloodied in the streets after they'd been sexually assaulted. One woman told me about how as they were fleeing, soldiers set fire to their home and took, I think, her nephew and her niece, 2 small children, and tossed them into the flames. I went to a place right on the border, and as I got there, we could see, and you could see in different places, you could see smoke going into the sky. But we got to the border, and we found a border guard who was willing to help us. And he's like, run. So we were running behind him. And we got there, and all of a sudden, right in front of us, this house just goes up with these enormous flames. There's palm trees there. The flames are towering over them, 100, 150 feet in the air. And as we're, because, so we were on land, and then there was a small river, and then there was a strip of land here, like no man's land, and behind it was the fence. So we're literally looking at the border, and this house was just across the border in Myanmar, and I was in Bangladesh. And so we're watching this house go on fire, and as we're watching, this woman, and I think it was her son, walk in front on the other side of the river in no man's land, and she crumples to the ground in front. And it turns out it was her house. It was her house. And she was sitting there watching it. And so a few minutes later, we talked to her, and she was telling us about losing their house and this sort of thing. And as we were talking, literally the ash from her house was raining down on her. And that place too, I mean, for me, I think in some ways the worst part was some of the videos that, because this is, I mean, we have seen, of course the world has seen ethnic cleansing before in a lot of different places. But this is ethnic cleansing in an era of universal smartphones. And so people had pictures and they had videos. And the videos were awful, really awful. There was one video of, because many people, they're coming across in boats. And there was one video of what appeared to be a group of people with their children who had come across, and maybe the boat got swamped or maybe they got fired upon because the Myanmar military were firing on people. And it's a group of men on the shore, and the river is shallow and slow moving, and they walk in and they pick up one body of a child, maybe 5 or 6, and then put it on the ground, and they walk in and pick up another, and they're just like picking up dead fish out of the river. It was awful. And there was another video at this place, the same place where I watched this house burn down, because the border in some places has now been mined. So people have left, they've fled, and the Myanmar military has installed mines. But of course, people didn't know that at first. And so the video that people had was somebody running along a path, and so you just sort of see the running, you see the path, and all of a sudden the video pans up, and there's 2 men carrying 2 women with just strips of flesh flopping where their knees were, because these were teenage girls who had stepped on these mines. When I first got there, right after when I got there, I walked into a hospital, and there was a 12-year-old boy there who was just lying, and you could see on his foot, right from the bottom through to the ankle, there's a hole right through. He'd been running away from soldiers, and they shot at a 12-year-old boy, and the bullet had gone right through his foot.
You're left kind of speechless when you listen to something like that. I have time for one more question, and then
Can we do a fun one?
And then we're going to open it up to the audience. And it seems weird to segue, but Donald Trump is heading to Asia this weekend. Maybe just quickly, what do you anticipate will unfold? I mean, obviously, he's got North Korea on the mind. On the brain?
So the last time an American leader took this long of an Asian trip, it was George H.W. Bush, the elder George Bush, in 1991. And he caught a stomach flu, and he vomited in the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister.
That's right.
So
I remember that photo.
we can all hold our breaths. We could be so lucky. I don't know. I'm not sure he travels well. He might be jet-lagged and cranky, so it might be an interesting trip.
They've highlighted his previous trips have been successes, relatively speaking. I just
it's funny. Reading the Chinese media, all of their trips are successes too.
Really?
Yeah. So he's going to play golf with the Japanese Prime Minister, and then he's going to go to South Korea, and then he's going to end up in China, and China's going to be the big highlight. So what's going to happen? I mean, they'll probably talk about North Korea. They'll probably talk about trade, but Trump is traveling with a contingent of 29 CEOs, and for China, it is much easier to do individual deals, and this is where their state-owned sector comes in as an extraordinary instrument of state power, which is that we will likely see over the course of the next week or so some very large figure individual trade deals that are done, or commercial deals, or whatever they are.
That Donald Trump can claim as a win.
Exactly. Well, without any systematic changes, which we're unlikely to see. So some of these issues with trade imbalance and that sort of thing that Trump has made some of his mantras, I'm not sure we're going to see much. If you look at, I was just looking back through the Xi Jinping visit to Trump at Mar-a-Lago and the outcomes of that. Because, of course, diplomats, these trips are a big deal, and they want outcomes. In the diplomatic community, they talk about deliverables. Every trip needs deliverables. What can we deliver? What can we show as an outcome from this? But in Florida, the deliverables were an agreement to talk more and a 100-day action strategy on economic measures that seems to have produced almost no fruit. So I'm not sure we'll see much. I think Trump will make some statements about North Korea, and perhaps China will say that there are additional measures that it's willing to take, but there are definite limits to what China is willing to do on North Korea. And China doesn't control North Korean politics. What China controls is the primary access point into North Korea of goods that it needs to import. There's a physical pipeline that brings oil across the border into North Korea from China. And there's a great deal of trade that goes back and forth between the two countries. So China can sort of cut them off from an economic perspective, but they can't actually, short of going in with their own armed forces, they can't stop the nuclear program. So China may actually have an increased incentive to do something on the nuclear program because the mountain where China does its nuclear testing is fairly close to the Chinese border. It's within 100 kilometers. So close, in fact, that when they do a nuclear test, they experience earthquakes, small earthquakes, on Chinese territory. And there have been, after the most recent nuclear test, there's been a number of small tremors that have emanated from that mountain. And it seems that whatever this hydrogen bomb test was, it may have created some internal damage to that mountain. Right. And China has a few red lines when it comes to North Korea. And one of them is, do not send any of your nuclear waste floating across our border. So if the geological structure of that mountain is now in question, I think you can probably expect China to take a harder role in terms of stopping any further testing there. But maybe that persuades North Korea to test in the air over the Pacific, so I'm not sure that advances us any farther.
Okay, so I think there might be some questions after that. This gentleman in the middle there, please.
Thanks for your comments. Well, I'd like you to, I worry for my children when it comes to China. China is a monster that the Western world has created, in my view, about 25 years ago. And about 25 years ago, you have not commented on China vis-a-vis Tibet. You have not commented on what is happening on the borders of China or what is happening in China on the South China Sea, what China is doing in Africa, basically colonizing that part of the world, but putting Chinese in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot happening around the world vis-a-vis China, and we in the West are naive as to what the impact on Canada could be. If you think we can do trade, which is favorable to us, there's continuously going to be a huge deficit, and I worry about that.
I mean, there are Western countries that don't have a trade deficit with China. Germany, for example. So I mean, that's not necessarily a given. And I think, I would have a really hard time supporting an argument that says that the economic rise of China was not in many ways an incredible good. I mean, we have a billion people who live lives that are much more advanced, much more comfortable lives than they would have been otherwise. So, like I said, I think we need to be, in terms of the South China Sea, I think China has been very canny. I think they got an accurate read on the Obama administration, and they figured that they could push forward their interests in the South China Sea, and they would not be opposed in a way that would stop them. And in the South China Sea now, the only way to stop China is through military intervention. I mean, they have occupied islands of their own creation, and the only way to kick them off is to do it by force. So in some ways, they read the situation accurately and pushed forward from that way. So I don't know. I mean, I think we need to have our eyes open about China, but let's not remember that. Let's not forget that there are an extraordinary number of innovative, interesting, sort of companies, ideas, and other things that China is contributing. They have a very different political system. They often have very different motivations than we would expect from sort of Western democratic systems. But the idea, I think, that we should necessarily be frightened of China, I don't know. I think we should. I would hope that we can be confident in the systems that we have, and that if we have confidence in those systems, that we can expect those to continue as we expect them. And if we don't have confidence in those systems, maybe the problem's more at home than it is in China.
Next question. That's the gentleman here in the front.
With all the attention on China, there's been very little attention to Japan. In the Western media, third, fourth largest country in the world. Can you talk about the impact of the recent election, which again, very, very little kind of headline coverage?
I remember going to Japan and speaking with the foreign ministry, and they were very sad because Japan, Tokyo used to be the headquarters for foreign correspondents in all of Asia, and many of them have, in the last 20 years, they've sort of upped stakes and gone to Beijing. So you're right. I mean, so it's interesting to see the way these dynamics are playing out around North Korea, for example. And there's a decent argument to be made that what is happening in North Korea helped to underpin the re-election of Abe, because he is a leader that has taken a much stronger line in terms of Japan's need to be able to defend itself, in terms of Japan's need to be able to sort of have its own military capabilities. And the idea that North Korea has been able to pursue its weapons the way it has in some ways allowed that argument to be more compelling inside of Japan. So I think, given his re-election and how soundly he won, we're probably likely to see more of that in Japan. And we've seen in Japan, more strongly than in South Korea, but we've seen it in South Korea too, talk about the need to perhaps reconsider nuclear weapons on their territory and that sort of thing. So we're dealing with a situation where there's a good deal of fear over what North Korea in particular presents, and the responses that might prompt in other nations could be worrisome going forward.
Over here, please.
Yeah, if you speak freely and uncensored. Sorry, speaking freely and uncensored today, and obviously in the paper and that sort of stuff, and you kind of touched on the fact that there's a little bit of control in the media in China. Two-part question. One, when you fly back to Beijing and you get off that plane, is there a tinge of, gee, they heard what I talked about today or anything like that? And B, do they control, is there an element of control in what you report or international journalists?
So there's certainly efforts to steer our reporting in certain ways. I've been brought into the foreign ministry on several occasions and been told that they weren't happy with what I've been writing. I mean, but in fairness, that's for journalists, that's not a particularly rare experience. Here, you might get called by a corporate public relations representative and told that they're not happy with your writing. So that's not entirely out of keeping with the experience elsewhere in the world. As far as my own writing, I mean, or what I'm saying today, I mean, I don't think I've said today much different from what I've written, and I'm perfectly aware that the Globe and Mail remains uncensored in China, so it's openly accessible. And we experience pressure and we experience difficulty in doing our jobs the way we would like to. It's difficult to talk to people. When I was during the nomination of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the largest political event of the year in China that just took place, I wanted to call Chinese academics to get a sense from inside China how the lineup was viewed, and called a dozen political scientists, people for whom this is their job, and only one agreed to talk. Some of them said, we've been told specifically not to speak to foreign media, and we're seeing more of that. So there is an attempt to control the message from that perspective. There's also, in terms of the controls on domestic media, those have grown far more strict. I was speaking this week with a Chinese journalist who works on international coverage, and they've been told to lay off commentary on issues when it comes to the United States and other countries. They can do factual reporting, even on the Trump visit. They can do factual reporting, this is going to happen, they're going to meet with this, but in terms of commentary and that sort of thing, they can't provide any of that coverage. And there are lots of areas that Chinese journalists can't write about. There are a tremendous number of very gifted Chinese journalists, but a number of them left the profession because there's not much, what they can do, that space is shrinking. And that has an impact on our ability as journalists, foreign journalists, to also know what's happening in the country, because, of course, our numbers are much smaller than the numbers of Chinese journalists. So in terms of efforts to control what the world sees about China, it's fairly wide-ranging, and I think there are elements of it that are effective.
And there's also state-run media, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of state-run media.
State-run
And that's actually one of the. I mean, you're probably going to see more of this. You have a Chinese television network, CGTN, that is trying very hard to make itself, an alternative to CNN. Whether they'll succeed, I don't know. But this is the object.
Well, so many questions. There was quite a few in this area.
Thank you, Nathan. I understand that Vietnam has come into some sort of entente with China concerning the territorial dispute. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's hard to know what's durable, because things come and things go, and there are political expedients that can create periods of calm, and there are political expedients that can create periods of conflict. So you've seen this with Vietnam in the South China Sea. You've seen this with the Philippines in the South China Sea. And that in some ways has been more notable because there was an international court ruling that sided with the Philippines in terms of its argument on different parts of the South China Sea. China responded with a fairly vigorous program of aid and other things and investment into the Philippines, and the Philippines has backed off on accepting enforcement of a court ruling in its own favor on the South China Sea. So, I mean, these things can change with changes of leadership, but I don't know. With the South China Sea, I mean, China sees it as a fairly significant imperative to create that area as part of the territory it can control. So you will see periods of calm, periods of more unrest, but it seems to me that the Chinese imperative there is quite clear, and it is to maintain a sense of control over those areas.
We actually, sorry?
So it sounds like they've been bought off, effectively.
I mean, there's different ways to create friends.
We have one last question.
It appears that the authoritarian stability model of China is becoming increasingly attractive to regimes in Africa, Asia. To what extent do you think it's becoming attractive to Europe and, unfortunately, North America?
I mean, we seem to be in an era of strongman leaders, for better or worse, I guess. I don't know. I don't think that we see a lot of, in sort of some of the core bedrock Western democracies, it doesn't seem like we see a lot of support for that sort of idea. There's the Chinese model. I mean, I think you could ask yourself, I mean, how attractive do you see the prospect of a one-party authoritarian state? And I can't imagine too many people in this room would put their hands up. But there are places that have experienced unrest, and there are places that have sort of fractured social situations, and in those cases, there is an attraction to what China has managed to accomplish, and this notion of countries to a greater extent moving toward democratic processes. I mean, that seems to have slowed, and we seem to be moving in the opposite direction in a lot of places. And I think for people who are Democrats at heart, I think that's worrisome.